So this is a pretty simple shot, and I shot it in the southwest of France. I was staying in this neighborhood for a few weeks earlier this year, and every morning I'd go to the boulangerie with my daughter to get bread and coffee and of course hot chocolate for her. And so I got to see it in the beautiful morning light every day. However, there was only one day with these really nice painterly clouds, so I decided to shoot it. There were also these birds flying around, so I just waited for one of the birds to get in position for my shot. So what I want to show you is where this started, and this is where the shot started. So this is from the raw image, and as I often say, raw is blah, and this is no exception. But it really doesn't take a lot of time or work to bring it back to this, which is the way the image looked to me when I saw it, and basically to get across the feel of it. So let's start with our base image here that comes from the raw to the camera. And there's a number of ways to go into this from Lightroom. You can right-click. You can go up under Photo and say Edit In, and we'll go into Photoshop. Now, the reason I'm going into Photoshop is because I want to make use of layers. And my little rule of thumb here, for those of you that haven't heard it before, is if you're going to use more than one plugin, or even if you're going to use one plugin more than one time, it's nice to have the flexibility that layers affords you, so that's why I use Photoshop. If you're just using, you're only going to use one plugin, there's no reason not to jump into it right from Lightroom, which fortunately Topaz allows you to do. So the first thing I'll do, the layout I have here, by the way, for Photoshop, my tools are on the left and my panels are on the right, and my layers are in the lower right here. So the first thing I'm going to do is duplicate my background, and I just make a habit of doing that because I want to preserve the original image, and so that way I'm working on a copy of it essentially in a new layer. And I'm a big fan of relabeling the layers with what we're going to do. So basically we're going to go into Clarity, and my mission here, and I'll just make a little note of it here, is we're basically just going to optimize the raw file if I can type. And the other thing I'm probably going to do is adjust some color, like the sky for instance, and probably just work on some of the other colors. So I'll just say saturation. Anyway, I just do this as a reminder to what I did if I have to go back to it later. So I'll go up to the filter menu at the top, go down to Topaz Labs, and then go down to Clarity here. Well, this will jump into Clarity now. So this is the Clarity plugin, and the first thing I'm going to do is reset. And that's if you look in the lower right of your screen, I hit the reset button here, and I just make a habit of doing that. What happens is the plugin, and this is true of most plugins, it will remember your settings from your previous session, and this is quite convenient if you're doing multiple images in a similar, with similar characteristics. But I just like to start from scratch, and if I didn't happen to be working on a similar image, this gets us back to neutral ground. So quick overview here. On the left-hand side, we have collections. So these are the collections on top, and those are collections of presets. So right now I have my collection selected, and these are all the presets I have in my collection. And as you click on them, they'll apply it to the image. So on top we have navigation controls, and then over on the right we've got our little navigator window, or histogram if we want it, and below that are the controls themselves. Now the real power of this program is this panel here called Dynamics under the major heading Clarity. So Dynamics and actually Tone Level too. And essentially Clarity is a contrast program, and I use Clarity on almost every image that I do. It really, by allowing you this really tightly controlled options for contrast from micro through high contrast, you can really get a nice sense of depth. And it really, I used to do these complex actions in Photoshop with multiple steps and using different modes, and it was kind of complex. This really simplifies it. It's a lot faster, it's a lot easier, and it's just nice and simple to understand and use. So it starts with micro contrast, which is just areas where one pixel doesn't have much difference in contrast from the other, so very minute differences in contrast, and they're pretty well labeled going up through low, medium, and high contrast. And by adjusting these sliders, you can, get various effects. So I'll zoom in just so you can see. So we'll go to 1-to-1 here, and if you haven't used this program before, you can just play around with these sliders. I'll move it all the way to the right so you can see what it does. That's overdoing it. We're already getting into the sort of grunge territory here. And really what I'm looking for is a more subtle increase in contrast. So that's the micro contrast slider. And I'm just going to move all these up just a little bit, the micro, the low, and the medium. And what I'm looking for here is just to kind of tweak that sense of depth. So you can click up here to look at what your original is, and then look at the processed version. So that's the after. A shortcut to that is the spacebar key. So if I hold down my spacebar, there's my before image, and I'm holding this down a little extra long because I know there's probably a delay on your end. And there's my after image. So right there, we've already got a nice sense of depth. A lot of times when you add contrast, you're increasing the darkness and the lightness. Let me go back to our overall view. And so what happens is by the time you get to the high contrast slider, most of the time I'm going to put that, or in general you're probably going to put that more in a negative direction. And it isn't going to have a big effect in this image. We don't have it super bright whites and super dark darks, but let me see if I go back to 0, you can see a little difference in there. So when I take the highest contrast areas and bring them to a negative, it brings back our shadow detail a little bit, like if you look up under this overhang. So that's pretty good now. The only other thing I might do is, what's nice is this tone level thing. So after you go through here and adjust all this contrast, sometimes because you've increased contrast, you need to bring back your shadows a little bit. So I usually boost the black level just a bit. So I'll just bring it up here maybe in the sort of 15-ish range. And if you see in this overhang here, you can see where it brought the shadow detail back a little bit. And I think that's probably looking pretty good. The other nice control along the right here is if you go down to hue, saturation, and lightness, you can tweak your colors a little bit. Now generally when I'm optimizing raw image, I bring the overall saturation up just because that's one of those areas where, oops, I'm on the hue, my apologies. Let me zero that out. I go to the saturation button here in the middle and then go down here and bring the overall up to, I usually do it around 7 or 8 for sort of reviving a raw image. I mean, raw images have to be processed. They come out of the camera looking very lackluster and certainly not like what you saw when you were there. So now we're really close to having this image back to the way it felt when I shot it and still maintaining a natural look to it. The only other thing I want to do is some more adjustments in this hue, saturation, and lightness. So one thing is the sky. The sky to me is looking a little bit cyan and not as blue as it should. And so what I'm going to do is go to the hue slider here, and then here's my blue slider. And if you want to make sure you're on the right slider, just move it to one extreme or the other, and you can see, now I don't want a purple sky and I don't want a cyan sky, but I want to take some of that cyan out. So I'm just going to tweak it, just move it a little bit to the right and bring a little bit of that blue hue back. And now I'll go to saturation, and when the light was hitting this facade in the morning, it was direct sunlight, so it just had a little more vibrance to it. And so I'm going to use the saturation control. And instead of doing the overall, I don't want everything to get saturated. I'm just going to do it individually by color. So this facade is kind of orange, and these outlines on the windows are kind of reddish. So I'm going to bump the orange saturation up a little bit to, just maybe 5 or 6 or somewhere in there, just a little bit to kind of bring back the color that I remembered. And the red is going to affect around the windows. Again, I can bring it to an extreme, and you can see that it's just isolating those reddish colors, but obviously I'm just looking for a more subtle touch here, so somewhere in this range, just around 10-ish. So the only other thing that I see here that I'd like to do is the sky was a little more blue than this. And this is a fairly common thing, right? The sky is generally a much brighter value than something you're shooting outdoors, and so it's fairly common that we want to darken our skies. Now, most people are going to run to the saturation control. I like to go to the luminance, which is the brightness, and just bring down the brightness of the blue. And again, you can see, we're making sure that we're in the right area. And I'm just going to bring it down just a hair, like maybe 9, 10, somewhere in there. And now, to me, this all looks natural. So, and it's also the feel of it. Remember, we're trying to have an impactful image and get the feel of what it was like, but keep the thing looking natural. So I'm going to hold down the space bar. There's our before, the sort of lackluster raw as it comes out of the camera. And there's my after, which is the way this thing felt when I looked at it. So I'm going to say OK. And as you can see, that was pretty simple. We have almost all the controls we need right there in clarity. And it's here in this layer. If you click on the eyeball in Photoshop, that turns off that layer. So this will give us a little before, and there's an after. Now there's only one more thing that I really want to do with this, and that's to sharpen it. Now in the old days, for a sharpening workflow, I would always advocate that people start with sharpening as their first step, the capture sharpening. So for those of you that don't know, in a sharpening workflow, you do capture sharpening, which is meant to recover what's lost in the process of capturing an image itself. So most cameras have an anti-aliasing filter that reduces the image quality, and just things from the electronics and that sort of thing, you just lose a little sharpness through the whole process. Even if your camera doesn't have an anti-aliasing filter, which this one doesn't, I like to use cameras that don't have them, you still lose a tiny bit of sharpness. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this layer, and I'm going to use Command J, which would be Control J on a PC. I'm going to relabel it, and we're going to call this detail, which is a good way to do your capture sharpening. And to finish up on that sharpening workflow, after you do capture sharpening to recover what was lost from the camera or a scanner if you're scanning an image, then the next thing is called selective sharpening or creative sharpening, and that's just if you want to add a little extra sharpening to specific areas to supplement what's already there, and then you use output sharpening for whatever kind of output you're doing. And the last one is just more math. So I'm going to do detail, and I'm going to say sharpen, because we're just going to do an overall capture sharpening here, and this is pretty easy. Go into filter, Topaz Labs, we're going to go into detail. And I'll show you here, the interface is very similar to what we saw in clarity. If you haven't seen these before, the interface is pretty similar in all of these. So again, we have collections on the left. I can click on Joel's collection here, and there are some of my presets. And then the controls are on the right. So the crux of this program, it's going through all the previews there, is the detail enhancement. So it divides into small, medium, and large, and then within each of those you have a boost where it deals with the lesser affected details in that category. So in essence, you have 6 adjustments, and then you can even break it down to shadow and highlight. If you want to affect, say, just the small details and just the highlights, you can do that. So pretty powerful program. But for capture sharpening, most of the time all I ever use is the small details slider, and you generally want to look at your sharpening at 100%. And typically for a camera without an anti-aliasing filter, I'm right at about 20. And that just brings back some of that detail that was lost. You don't want to overdo the details, or it starts to look a little too crunchy. So there's my before, and there's my after, and you can see it brought back some of the detail. And then I always like to look at these at 50% too, just to make sure, because that's 50% is going to be sort of a screen equivalent of scrutinizing a large print. So if I hold down the before key, it's going to be subtle on your end, looking at it over the internet and all that, and there's the after, but you can still see the effect. And I'm going to say OK, and that's pretty much it. We're done. So let's hop back into Lightroom, and I'll do a before and after for you here. And there we are. This is a pretty basic thing. It took me much longer to explain it than it would to do it. It's probably about a 3 to 5 minute process to just optimize a raw capture to get it back to the way we want it to look and the way it felt when we shot it.